Hey Dunchbags, what's going on? It's Landon Remixes here, and welcome to my Top 10 Albums of the Year video. Now, first of all, I'd like to mention that my voice is going to sound a little weird because I came up with a cold or something, I'm not really sure what, but basically my voice is just going to sound a little weird, and I didn't really feel up to recording this today, so sorry if I'm acting a little different, but basically I wanted to record this and get it up before the new year, so I decided to do this video today, which is really my only chance to do it. So with that, just keep that as a constant reminder if I sound a little weird, that this is because this is on a very strange day for me that I normally wouldn't do commentary or anything on, but I decided to do that today. Secondly, I'd like to thank Anthony Fantano, also known as the Needle Drop, for kind of inspiring me to do album reviews. I think from this point on, probably starting January 2015, I'm going to start doing individual album reviews instead of a big 2014 roundup or 2015 next year roundup of all the albums I really liked. I'm going to do them individually and then lead up to a shorter Albums of the Year video, because this is something I've been doing a long time. I've been collecting CDs. I'm somewhere around 150 this year, and I think I bought like 50 of those this year. So it's kind of crazy, and I think somewhere around 30 are all new albums. I bought a lot of older stuff, like Above and Beyond's group Therapy. I bought this year, even though I previously wanted it, I just didn't get around to buying it until this year. So I basically judged each album based on individual track enjoyability, flow, uniqueness, diversity, and production, and those are the main 5. If I would have gone by only individual track enjoyability, the top 10 would have been a lot different. For example, my number 4, I think, would have probably been number 2 instead of number 4. You'll see what I'm talking about when I mention it, but basically it would have been a lot different if I would have just gone by track enjoyability instead of the 5 different things that I went by, which really changed the order up a lot, and that was basically to make an unbiased opinion instead of it's all sounds that I really liked, which it's mostly going to be that, but instead of just being that, it's going to be a wider variety of like diversity and, for example, and uniqueness, like have I heard this music before? Is it any different? Does this artist stretch out a lot and change each track by track, kind of showing off a different style? That's what I am looking for with these album reviews. Number 10 is Pink Floyd's The Endless River. Now, I think at the point when I bought this album, I hadn't listened to any of it, and it really kind of blew me away when I first listened to it. The only really bug I have with it is that the tracks kind of, even though they flow very well together, it kind of gets a little old. I'm not saying it gets old, because it really, I could say if this had come out like 50 years ago, this would have been a timeless record, so I really like this album as a whole, but because each track kind of sounds like the next a lot, maybe, maybe a little, and because it flows so well, I think that's part of the reason it kind of all sounds like one big track, and that's kind of what kills it for me, is because it, instead of sounding like a real full studio album, it sounds just like one giant track, which I like, but it really didn't push me to call it any higher than number 10. And basically, even though I had heard this album and I was like, wow, I really have to include this in my top 10, it might even be in my top 5, which is what I was thinking at first, but then eventually I decided to kind of push it back, and when I went into final judging for the albums, I just didn't think it was high enough for this spot. But there were a lot of albums that I really did like that didn't make this. This album actually has a very high rating for me, and I really did enjoy it. And I think it's Pink Floyd's last album. I'm a fan of theirs. I haven't bought much more than Dark Side of the Moon, which I should be getting The Wall fairly soon, even though it's like really expensive just for the CD version, which it's kind of crazy. But anyway, I've really liked their music for a while, and I think this album definitely showcased something different and something that I really enjoyed more than their previous efforts. Number 9 is Tove debut album, Queen of the Clouds. Now, if you guys know me, I got the clean version, because that's just who I am. And basically, first time listening, I was like, not so impressive. Second and third and fourth times, I was like, wow, this album is spectacular. I loved it. I thought it was extremely over-sexualized, but somehow I still managed to enjoy it more than a lot of albums that came out this year. I follow Tove Lo because basically she's an EDM vocalist, and even though her song Stay High kind of pushed her into the mainstream recognition, I still liked her from her work with, let's say, Alesso, Heroes, and Seven Lions. That's basically how I found out about her, was actually a Paris Blom remix of Strangers that she did with Seven Lions and Mine and Shane 54. But I really enjoyed this album as a standalone, non-EDM record, even though, as I said, it's way over-sexualized and I'm not normally into that. I enjoyed it. I could safely say I liked every track, and this would be another one of those albums that if it weren't based on 5 different things and it was just based on individual track enjoyability, this record would be up higher in my top 5, probably number 4, number 3, something like that. But because I judged it on, is this something I've heard before, it's truly a pop kind of alternative record. It's different, but it's still kind of stuff that I've heard before, and each track kind of doesn't vary much from the other tracks. So that's why it was low on this list, but I did enjoy it. I enjoyed it far more than Pink Floyd's record, actually, but the way that I rated it, I really don't think that it deserved a higher spot. But still a great record, Queen of the Clouds. Number 8 is The Noisy Freaks, Straight Life. This album devoured everyone basically this year except for one, but we'll save that for later. Because each track, it kind of sounds alike. It's a really funk kind of, not really down-tempo, it's kind of up-tempo funk, I guess. It's got a lot of new disco, a lot of EDM influence, there's electro house. This album is spectacular. There were a couple tracks that I really wasn't crazy about, including Freaks Orchestra and Straight Life. Those tracks just really didn't attract me very much, but the album as a whole kind of blew me away. For a group so small, their production was incredible, but I thought this album was going to place higher, but the way that I graded it, once again, put it a lot lower than I was expecting. But that just kind of clears more room to say, wow, the albums that I picked for my top 5 are really spectacular, and kind of showed off everything. I bought the CD version, which has an extra remix. I wasn't crazy about that, but I didn't include that in as the album because it's a bonus track, and I don't include bonus tracks in the thing, or like intro tracks. None of those I really included, but as a whole, this album is great. You should definitely go pick it up. You can get it off their Bandcamp, I think, and it's definitely worth it. They're 2 French guys. They're really friendly. I've talked to them on Twitter and various things. They are awesome, so make sure to check out Noisy Freaks Straight Life. Number 7 is Desire Paths by Technimatic. I actually got this as a recommendation from my friend Martin, who said this was his favorite album of 2014. We were comparing kind of our lists, and he told me this was his absolute favorite that had come out this year. I hadn't even heard of it. I hadn't heard of Technimatic. They've been promoted on UKF Drum and Bass. They've been promoted everywhere, basically. And I got this album, and it blew my expectations, I could say. Even though it didn't make my top 5, I don't know how to explain this. I really loved all the albums on this list, but this one especially just showed off a really good amount of production. It is definitely some of the greatest drum and bass I've ever heard. I'm into drum and bass, but not as much as I could be. I'm more into house music, electro house, melodic stuff. You know how it is. But anyway, this album showed me that drum and bass is more than just kind of your average EDM sound or anything. It's really a beautiful thing, and the sampling choice is excellent. Production is great. Diversity wasn't exactly great. That's why it's probably so low on here, because it's drum and bass and it sticks with that throughout the entire album. It kind of, each track kind of kind of a straight beat throughout. It really didn't impress me as much as it could have, even though each by individual tracks, it was fantastic, I think, but I really honestly don't think as an album it was as great as it could have been. For example, Rameses B's album Reborn, it was a drum and bass album that didn't make my top 10, but it showed off more diversity than this one did. But because it's production and I'll get to it later. It's in my honorable mentions, which I'm going to have at the end. So anyway, Technimatic, Desired Paths, definitely a great album, and go pick it up if you want to. Number 6 is the debut Skrillex album, Recess. Now, I can admit I wasn't that big of a Skrillex fan prior to Recess. I didn't really like his first 2 EPs at all. I was on the Skrillex hater base, or whatever you call it. Lots of people had been in that scene where it was like, oh, Skrillex is terrible, I love Deadmau5 more. I actually like Deadmau5 and Skrillex now. I ended up seeing him live this summer. He was really awesome. Anyway, the album showed a very wide variety of diverse sounds. It's got dubstep, it's got drum and bass, house, deep house, basically everything you could really want in an EDM-centered album, and I really enjoyed it for that. And even though on my first listen I was kind of, I'm not really too interested, I ended up liking it a lot more after that, really appreciating it as an album rather than just a collection of singles, which is really what it was. Even though it was, I agree with Anthony Fantano's thing where he says that because it's so diverse, it leads to a lot of hit or miss tracks, and I agree that some of the tracks like Dirty Vibe and Coast is Clear I really wasn't crazy about, but a lot of the tracks were really hard-hitting, and I just liked it overall. So that's number 6, Skrillex, Recess. Pick it up if you haven't. Number 5 is actually a tie between Dillon Francis, Money Sucks, Friends Rule, and Deadmau5's new album, While 1 is Less Than 2. Initially, I would have put Deadmau5 way above Dillon Francis. The way it ended up working out, they gave the exact same tie. The way I actually organized it, each album was to a tenth of a point. It's on a 1 to 10 scale. These were both on the same tenth of a point, so I really wanted to include both of these, and I didn't want to kick the Endless River off, so I decided to include both of them as a tie rather than replacing one as higher than the other. Really, they were both completely different albums. Like, they're not a tie for any reason of them being similar at all. They just happen to get the same rating for different reasons. The production on Deadmau5's is a lot nicer. I enjoy that a lot more. The tracks aren't as diverse. Dillon has a lot of different styles, a little bit of big room, a lot of Moombaton, a little bit of progressive house, a lot of different stuff. My favorite track's probably When We Were Young, which is the lead single. On Deadmau5's, I really liked the tracks that followed his 7 album, like Avicii and Gula. That just kind of blew me away, and when I saw him live this summer, that kind of brought me up to a point where I was like, wow, this is really awesome stuff, and I'm really enjoying it. But for some reason, they're a tie. Not really sure why, but I wanted to include both of them, so there it is. While 1 is Less Than 2, and Money Sucks, Friends Rule. Number 4 is probably, if I was going by track enjoyability, my number 1, I mean, not number 1, number 2 album of the year, Coldplay's Ghost Stories. I was super impressed with this from the very first listen. I said, wow, this album is awesome. Sky Full of Stars with Avicii. There's just so much gold on this. Very down-tempo, relaxing. Kind of reminded me of their X and Y sound, though, which is kind of why I rated it lower than it should have been if I would have done it a different way. Because this is honestly not new material completely, but it's enjoyable material, which is why I like it so much. And after I got the live version of the album, it gave me a huge more respect for the album. It's probably one of my favorite albums of all time, even though it's not in my top 5 for this year. I think I actually enjoyed it more than Milo Xyloto, which was my previous favorite album, and I think my number 1 of this year is my all-time favorite album, so we'll get to that. But Coldplay's Ghost Stories, it's a really good album, shows off a lot of good production, especially with Jon Hopkins on Midnight. It's just a really great album overall, and like I said, it would have been higher if I would have rated it different, but because it's kind of a repeat of X and Y, I think, and kind of kept similar themes in every track, and the flow wasn't that great, it's lower than it probably should have been. So there it is, Coldplay Ghost Stories. Number 3 is from veteran Monstercat artist Haywyre. It's called Twofold Part 1. The only bone I really had to pick with this, which is why I almost thought about disqualifying it, is because it's only got 8 tracks, which, as my previous friend Martin explained, it's just a glorified EP, which I don't agree with necessarily, but this isn't exactly, I would call it a full debut album, even though it's neither a debut nor a really partial album. It's 8 tracks, one's an intro, which is kind of why I'm on the fence of including it, but because its production and its song choice and its diversity and flow was so good, I had to include it in my top 5. It was a great album. I got it blindly, I don't even think I heard a single song off it. I think I might have heard The Schism, which Monstercat premiered, but after that I pre-ordered the album. This is the first album that Monstercat has ever put out, so as you can see, my computer background, I really love Monstercat, and I would love to support more of their albums. I can't wait for Twofold Part 2. This album is awesome. I can't really explain it. It's very unique, stuff that I and most other people haven't really heard before, so all I can say is check it out. You can actually get it for free on his website, haywyremusic.com, I think. Don't take my word for that, but go check it out. Number 2 is what I probably would have been number 3 if I would have gone by track enjoyability. It's kind of that again. Knife Party's Abandoned Ship, their debut album. It's fantastic. Production is great. I don't know how to explain this. I've been waiting for a Knife Party album for years. I've been listening to them since like 2011 or 12. I don't really know. I haven't been into electronic music that long, so I can't really say, but I've liked them for a very long time, and I've been waiting for their debut album that they announced last year, and it took them over a year to release it actually, but this album just kicks. I'm not crazy about I like the intro, but Resistance was not one of my favorite tracks. I wasn't crazy about Micropenis, or, yeah, there's just a few tracks which kind of kept me from thinking it was the best, I guess. That was my main pick with it. The production is insane, the drops are crazy, I don't know how else to describe this album. EDM Trend Machine is hilarious. All of the tracks just show off everything that I love about Knife Party, and that's why I included it in my top 10 as my number 2. It's just so good. Knife Party Abandoned Ship. Check it out. And now time for the number 1 album of 2014. You guys probably guessed this a while ago, probably. I've been saying it the entire year. I'm not sure if I've said it in any videos, but Worlds by Porter Robinson. This album is phenomenal. I don't know how else to describe it. Every track is just perfect. I would call each track at least a 9.5 to me. Every song I enjoyed from the moment I listened to it. When Divinity kicked in, I was just like, It's just, I don't know how else to describe it. Sea of Voices, the lead single that first came out, I was blown away by it. I wasn't that big of a Porter Robinson fan prior to Worlds, or Sea of Voices for that matter, but this album just completely blew it away. It's probably my favorite album of all time, I think. There's nothing that could possibly beat it. I enjoy every track to probably the max I could. I actually, in my rating system, it even got like a 9.6, I think it was, which is probably the highest I could ever rate anything, which would basically be a 10, but because of the point system, I couldn't give it a solid 10. Because some of the tracks are a little similar, so because of that I had to rank certain things a little lower, which brought it down to a 9.6. But the production is insane. I love this album more than anything else I own. I also got I pre-ordered it as soon as Sad Machine came out, which is when pre-orders started, so I got an autographed copy by Porter himself. Just completely blew me away. I don't think there's a single album that could possibly beat this in any way. Like, even Abandoned Ship or Coldplay's album was probably the closest it could come, but I don't think a single album I own could come as close to as good as this one is for me. And I found it kind of weird that I think Anthony Fantano rated it a 5 for good reasoning, but I completely disagreed with him on it, and this hasn't appeared in any top 10s I've seen except Your EDM's top 10 at place number 2. And yeah, so that's my number 1. For honorable mentions, first of all, I've got Jon Hopkins' Immunity, which was absolutely crazy good. The only problem was it released in December 2013, so I couldn't really include it. Otherwise, it probably would have been number 2 on my list this year, because that is an insanely good album. Secondly, Avicii's True Avicii by Avicii remix album. It would have definitely been in my top 10, other than the fact that it's a remix album. I think it was going to be number 8. It was going to place above Pink Floyd's The Endless River and Tove's Queen of the Clouds. As far as I know, it beat it by about 0.1, and it would have made my top 10. I was planning on keeping it in there until basically I saw Pink Floyd's album wasn't going to be in there, and I said, you know what, it's a remix album. This is all stuff that I heard last year on True. I can't include it in my top 10. So basically that would have been in there because I really, really liked it, but I disqualified it because it was in the top 10. Lastly, I already mentioned this, Rameses B's Reborn. It was a great album, and it missed the top 10 by 0.1. Pink Floyd's The Endless River beat it by just that much, so I decided I might as well throw it in the honorable mentions. It's a great drum and bass album. Definitely buy it if you haven't yet. It is good. The sampling is great. I don't know how else to explain it. The diversity was good, but it just wasn't really, it didn't appeal to me as much as it could have, and that's why it was so low and wasn't able to make my top 10. So anyway, before people complain about why I didn't have the FKA Twigs album, why I didn't have the Spoon album, these are all albums that I really listened to very minimally, but I still listened to, and I just didn't find attractive enough to include in here or even buy. Like I said, The Needle Drop's top 50, none of the albums I have that are in his top 100, or top 50, I think. I was thinking about buying the Swans album, which is his number 1. It's called To Be Kind. I wasn't really interested by the previews, but I might get it anyway. Yeah, so what do you guys think about the top 10? What's your favorite album of the year? Leave it in the comments below. Anyway, I'm Landon Remixes, and I hope you enjoyed my top 10 albums of the year. See you guys later.